So we're going to talk a little bit about something that was introduced last year and is a hot topic with a lot that's just been happening in the last few months. And that has to do with pre-hospital autonomous casualty care, where and what's developing in that area and how it could affect us. So this is a slide from last year, and for those of you who remember, and that's why the date is not incorrect at the top. And I mentioned at the end of my presentation last year that there will be new initiative on autonomous and closed-loop systems for things like management of oxygenation, ventilation, blood pressure, sedation, anesthesia, fluid management, temperature, the usual list. And especially applicable to the pre-hospital environment, whether that's for casualty care in the military, natural disasters, and so forth. So this was kind of early last year when I mentioned that it was something that was coming, and we ended up meeting. There was a list of what might happen. We did end up meeting at the Society for Technology and Anesthesia. We had a workshop for a few hours with a lot of very good discussions about what some of the applications might be, but more than that, what are some of the real core challenges? If you did have a system that was smart and autonomous, how do we make sure it's actually going to work? Not from a fundamental engineering standpoint. You know, there are plenty of engineers who know how to make sure that if you integrate things, the communication will work and it will be robust and reliable. But really from the medical knowledge side of how might a system like that be effective or not effective. And we'll dig into that a little bit now. So that was last year when I was here, and then the January STA meeting I just mentioned. And then this past July, there was a very important event, a meeting that was held at the FDA. And this was a federal listening session on interoperability of medical devices, data, and platforms to enhance patient care. Last year, in February, the US federal government made an announcement that they were interested in receiving input on this topic. They wanted to know what kind of products there were, what kind of ideas there were, and moreover, why we were not seeing progress in integration of systems to improve patient care. A number of societies and organizations submitted a response to the request for information. The American Society of Anesthesiologists submitted a response, as did the Society for Technology and Anesthesia, as well as a number of hospitals and other organizations. And those responses are publicly available online on that website, the NIDRD website. Now, this is a little confusing, so I'll just take a few seconds to explain the letters and acronyms, and then don't try to remember it. There might be a test tonight, but we'll see. So the FDA hosted the session, a federal listening session, but the session, the organization that ran this is called NITRD, N-I-T-R-D, the Networking and IT Research and Development Program, which is a US governmental organization that coordinates almost all federal research in the US government on technology R&D. That's 24 member agencies that invest $5 billion. And that's how they coordinate through an organization called NITRD that almost no one ever heard of. But that's what they do. And they have another component in their group. They have a working group, which is here on the slide, called HITRD, which is the Health Information Technology Research and Development Interagency Working Group. So that's how this thing came about. It was led at very senior levels, and it was held at the FDA. In the agenda, there was an opening presentation by Dr. Jeff Shuren. Dr. Shuren is the head of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. For those of you who are manufacturers who've brought products to market in the US in anesthesia, you've gone through CDRH and through the Office of Device Evaluation. And they're the folks, they have people that look, for example, at physiologic closed-loop systems and anesthesia systems and everything else. So Dr. Shuren presented, and he conveyed his support for interoperability and for technology advances that could improve the quality of healthcare delivery and safety. He was very clear on that. And then there were other sessions as well. One of the sessions was presented by Dr. Sandy Weininger, who some of you may know, biomedical engineer. Another by Dr. Loretta Schlachter-Fairchild from the Department of Defense. And I'm going to present some of her slides here right now. These are her slides. And you'll see why I'm presenting some of her content. So she has a portfolio in the Department of Defense, the Military Health Service, and she works on medical autonomous systems for improving healthcare delivery. Now, this is a subset of her slides. I only included those, given the time we have, that were most directly related to our topic here. Dr. Schlachter-Fairchild is a PhD and a U.S. Army nurse, and I will tell you, she really gets it at the technology and the patient level. So this is part of the message this is the Medical Research and Development Command, MRDC, and this shows a little bit about the mission and vision in the future, the notion of delivering medical supplies with drones, with quadcopters, evacuating patients with autonomous systems, with autonomous vehicles, whether they're on air or land, and treating patients using medical robotics. I'm going to drill deeper into some of these and skip other topics. So this is an example of two kind of areas that they're focusing on. One is virtual health, which is kind of obvious, but we'll talk more about it. And the other is medical, robotic, and autonomous systems, MEDRAS. And we're talking, and you can see the text, research, design, and prototype, future next generation medical, robotic, autonomous, and unmanned medical capabilities to deliver high-quality combat casualty care while optimizing the medical logistic footprint, meaning do more with less stuff, in far forward and dispersed operations. Far forward, difficult areas to access and deliver medical care. So it's envisioned for new kinds of environments where it's very difficult to bring medical personnel to the site. And in fact, it's envisioned that, forget about the golden hour, because evacuating patients to an environment where they can be cared for with full support is becoming potentially much more difficult. And so the notion is to care for patients in place, not too far from the point of injury, for up to 3 days. That's officially, the term for that is prolonged field care or prolonged care. It's 72 hours for someone with a major injury. Not a minor undertaking, which is why this is a big challenge. So the future view of medical support would include this perspective of close to the point of injury or maybe at a point of stabilization, autonomous critical care capabilities, autonomous intubation, airway access through some means like a cricothyrotomy, other autonomous interventional procedures with remote support and closed loop support and evacuation. This is the future vision, and this is being worked on. Components of this are being worked on, and some of it has been worked on for years, and it's being brought together now that it's closer to a reality. So this part we'll talk a little bit more about is the medical autonomous and unmanned systems. And what they're doing now, a big part of the work is conducting the research, either basic research or exploratory research. And the exploratory research includes reaching out to other countries and around the world and saying, do you have technologies that could be pulled into this initiative and brought together to build out some of these envisioned capabilities? The U.S. government, I'm not speaking for the government, of course, but the U.S. government has, if at all possible, is not going to try to build everything if these things exist elsewhere in friendly nations around the world. That's just foolish. And so there's a tremendous interest in kind of technology scavenging, finding those things that we could pull together to achieve this. And that's only on the technology side. Clearly on the knowledge side, it requires a vast pool of expertise and knowledge to avoid making obvious mistakes. So you can see even the list here: develop novel approaches to automated vascular access, needle thoracotomy, functional hemodynamic monitoring, and closed-loop resuscitation. It requires models of the pathophysiology and so forth, and of course research strategies for incorporating and deconflicting multiple closed-loop autonomous systems. Everyone here knows this is not a trivial goal to deconflict multiple closed-loop systems. So, here's a little more detail and fleshing this out a bit. The purpose: develop semi-autonomous and autonomous closed-loop combat, casualty, triage, diagnosis, and physiological monitoring. And if we go to the bottom of the slide, you see some of the research areas listed, and multi-purpose, unmanned, platforms for medical missions and AI assistance and so forth. So you can see a whole environment is being considered and planned and built for the future. Virtual health, I'll just mention briefly, of course, plays a key role in this, whether it's telementoring, teleconsultation, remote assessment and guidance. But the military is well aware that you can't depend on communications for telehealth, and so you have to have intelligent fallback approaches if there's a loss of remote connections, obviously. So this is all part of that, those considerations. So now moving with a little more depth into the part that I intended to focus on, which is the medical device interoperability reference architecture. This is a research collaboration. It's the military health services recognize, as we all have here, the long-standing barriers with medical device interoperability, the difficulty of obtaining data for black box recorders, that the data that you can get is not always the data that you want. And of course, that's only acquiring data, but for these advanced systems, one has to control the devices as well. It may be controlling an infusion pump, but it also may be changing other settings and flow rates, back pressure, a host of other things, maybe changing the gain and averaging time on a pulse oximeter, many other things you might have to change on a device. So it recognizes that research is needed for the systems, and so to achieve some of these things, there's been a project that was initiated this past year out of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory as a prime contractor, and I've been serving as the clinical PI for a 2-year project to kick some of this off and to start to find the community and build out a reference architecture for interoperability. And so we're making progress on developing that reference architecture. But you don't want to write an architecture in a vacuum. You want to think about what are the clinical use cases, what are the clinical scenarios, which devices will be used to treat things like head trauma, shock, multi-organ failure, burns, all the things that are kind of obvious that you might see in these environments that they're trying to address. So this is the work that's been going on, and a well thought out and developed medical device interoperability reference architecture. Again, this is not interoperability for the sake of just acquiring data. This is a reference architecture to support autonomous systems. So it's a much greater level of complexity than just acquiring some data for a research project. So this bulleted list points out some of the challenges and some of the things that we've been thinking about that are outlined here. Well, are we ready to do this, right? So I'm sure appropriately people will say, is this premature, or is the world ready? And I would propose, yeah, we're absolutely ready. There have been significant advances in autonomous technologies. I don't have a Tesla yet, but if anyone wants to get rid of one, let me know. That's a good example of how far we've come. Of course, in aviation, we see that with artificial intelligence. And even on the regulatory side, if you look at the regulatory side, digital health regulation has matured greatly in the last few years, which really heralds good things for the kind of regulatory changes that might be needed for these systems. Also, there are standards that have been developed already that are necessary foundational standards, like the standard for physiologic closed-loop controllers in IEC, the Integrated Clinical Environment, or ICE standard, which has just moved from ASTM International to AAMI and is now 2700-1. This has just happened this past month, where we have been developing a draft standard for a black box recorder, which is different than the kind you're using, which uses a lot of video data. The black box recorder in this case is more of a forensic data logger. So if you have a bunch of equipment all connected doing sophisticated closed-loop control, you have to have a data log, because when something doesn't work, you need to understand exactly what failed. Exactly. Maybe the algorithm made a good decision and sent a command over to the ventilator, but the command wasn't received, or it wasn't acknowledged, or it wasn't executed. If you don't have that information, how can manufacturers possibly manage the liability? And how could one improve the quality of a system like that? So it's kind of the basic command and control and device performance has to be recorded. And of course, there's been many other progress in other communications and standards. And expert workshops are a critical part of bringing in the community input, like the one at STA last year, and even the one we had yesterday afternoon. There were a lot of really good ideas that surfaced in a short time. Examples are how could a system detect spurious data? from motion, sensor interactions, like a cuff inflating on the same side as a sensor that requires perfusion or pulsations. All these things have to be detected, or we know the system won't work. We don't have to do the experiments. We all live this world, and we understand this is how these things will fail. So these are foreseeable interactions, and therefore the platform and the architecture has to be able to handle this. So some of these issues came up. Some of them came up yesterday, such as what are the regulatory considerations for physiologic closed-loop control. I recommend reading the paper that was published by the FDA group after the FDA workshop. It has important information. It even points out the difference between an open loop and closed loop. On top, clinician is controlling a device to do something, that's open loop. And on the bottom, the clinician sets the set point. In the top, they set the set point, like I'd like to deliver inspired anesthetic agent concentration, that would be the top example. And on the bottom, they have a system that maintains, could be inspired, it could be expired, or entitled, or many other things, or just inspired oxygen to a target SpO2. That's a very simple example, but it actually is helpful from what I could determine from the conversations. The other thing that comes up is the notion of, well, this is going to be dangerous. What should we do? And the answer is, well, don't confuse the technology with the risk. We all use closed-loop control systems. Anyone who has a thermostat on the wall in their home has a closed-loop control system for their heat and their air conditioning. We don't consider that dangerous. So something could be technically sophisticated and safe. It could be technically simple and dangerous. Don't mix those. And I think that this Missy Cummings, who's a professor and a military pilot, one of the first female pilots in the U.S., works in this area, and she did a very nice job of explaining the notion of on the loop, which is human supervisory control, such as being in the OR or ICU while the closed-loop system is operating, or maybe doing it through telemedicine and observing its effect and the effect on the patient. So let's be more creative, I think, about the whole thing and figure out how we could incrementally develop these advanced technologies rationally and carefully and safely so that they improve care. And there's just a lot of good information and deep thinking that's occurred that we could leverage. There are frameworks such as levels of automation. Here's an example of levels of automation applied to physiologic closed-loop medical devices. Medical level of automation 1 all the way through 4. And this is taken from that FDA paper that was published in ANA. And this past summer, I published with Dr. Weiniger another example of levels of automation in which we based it upon the Society of Automotive Engineers levels for cars. And this is, I would say, work in progress. But if it could help us understand the risk, the hazards, and the approaches, then it's useful. And if not, it may be worthless. We'll see. So with that, I wanted to switch to a video. It's about 2 minutes. We'll see based on the time. Let me know. This is on YouTube, which is what keeps us all going in the world.
In recent military conflicts, air superiority and relatively few casualties allowed medical treatment and evacuation within 60 minutes, the so-called golden hour. Today, joint military planners cannot rely on these assumptions. In future military conflicts and in civilian disaster events, limited air access and high numbers of casualties may result in an overwhelming of available medical and evacuation resources. Military and disaster relief first responders need autonomous capabilities to sustain patients for up to several days until evacuation is possible. The Defense Health Agency funded the Army Medical Research and Development Command to research technical architectures to support autonomous medical systems for prolonged care in austere environments. The research product is a medical device interoperability reference architecture, supporting advancement of secure, open, and reliable autonomous care systems. As in other industries, autonomous medical care is expected to advance incrementally, progressing from technology assistance to semi-autonomous to highly autonomous. In this animation, caregivers connect patients to closed-loop autonomous care systems pre-assembled in kits delivered to the site. The systems continuously monitor patient vitals and provide autonomous control of interventions, such as IV fluids and medication infusions. These systems allow available medical personnel to care for other casualties, while the autonomous support provides a consistent and reliable level of skilled care. Authorized medical personnel on site or at other locations can monitor the status of all the patients via mobile devices or by remote access via telemedicine. In the future, robotics will also play a greater role. The autonomous care system evacuates with the patient, providing care along the way. Similar to aviation black box flight recorders, the autonomous system downloads all the details of care for later documentation in the patient record and analysis for quality and care improvement. Note that military and civilian hospitals might also use autonomous care systems to standardize care delivery, optimize patient outcomes, improve patient safety, and allow nursing and other clinical staff to focus on the patient's care needs rather than repetitive medical device operations. Open architecture is key to achieving flexibility. Medical personnel should be able to use any combination of interoperable, secure medical devices necessary to treat a patient, or easily integrate additional clinical applications. Medical personnel should be able to hot swap devices. Hospitals should be able to upgrade medical devices and software without high cost. The reference architecture's open system design that applies industry consensus, interoperability, and security standards is key to this flexibility. The research team draws upon stakeholders from government, industry, academia, and civilian healthcare who are on the cutting edge of integrated clinical environments, closed-loop care systems, medical device and cybersecurity standards, and regulatory clearance and approvals for patient safety. A community-accepted medical device interoperability reference architecture will enable the innovation of autonomous care systems with increasing flexibility, reliability, safety, and cybersecurity capability.
I think those are all the key messages, and I'm happy to take any questions and have discussions.